Comrades, let us speak plainly and without hesitation. The world as it stands is not natural, it is not eternal, it is a construct, forged by the relentless hands of those who claim wealth, power and privilege while condemning the majority to lives of labor and deprivation. Look around you. Observe the towers of opulence, the glittering marketplaces, the endless spectacle of abundance. But recognize also the factories, the sweat-soaked fields, the long hours of toil and the invisible suffering of the masses. This is not happenstance. This is the order of a system designed to profit from human misery. The present, my friends, is the triumph of capital over human life. It is the subjugation of necessity to greed. It is a society in which the worker produces the wealth but receives only scraps, while the owner accumulates power and property, indifferent to the very hands that sustain him. The wage, the contract, the law itself, these are instruments of control, masking exploitation with the illusion of fairness. And yet those who accept this present as immutable are complicit in their own oppression. But history is not the property of the rich. History belongs to those who struggle, to those who refuse to bow to the tyranny of inherited privilege. It is the labourers, the artisans, the farmers, the thinkers, and the marginalised who hold within themselves the seed of revolution. Each act of compliance strengthens chains, each act of resistance loosens them. To accept the present is to surrender to the dictatorship of capital. To refuse it is to wield the power of collective consciousness. Let us not be deceived by the superficial comforts of consumerism or the false promises of upward mobility within this corrupt system. The structure is designed to perpetuate inequality. Every law, every institution, every currency exists to reinforce the hierarchy, to obscure the fundamental truth that the worker, and the worker alone, creates value and yet remains enslaved by the very wealth they produce. The capitalist prospers on the sweat and blood of the proletariat, and the state legitimizes this theft under the guise of order. Comrades, the solution is neither patience nor reform, but organization. The workers of the world must recognize themselves as a class, bound not by nationality or faith, but by shared labor and shared exploitation. When the multitude awakens to its collective strength, when the exploited understand the mechanics of their subjugation, then the present will shatter, and a new world can emerge, one in which labor is no longer a tool of profit, but a means of human fulfillment, where resources are distributed by need, not by wealth, and where freedom is not the privilege of the few, but the right of all. The future belongs to those who refuse to accept the present, those who gaze upon inequality and do not look away, those who endure injustice and vow to overturn it, those who understand that oppression is a structure, not fate, and that dismantling it is an imperative of reason, morality, and survival. Rise, comrades! Let the factories echo with voices of solidarity. Let the streets resound with the march of unity. Let the institutions tremble before the awakening of the masses. The struggle is not distant, it is here now. Every act of labor is an act of potential liberation. Every moment of consciousness is a spark of revolution. Reject the present, organize, educate, agitate. Only then will the future belong to you, not as a gift, but as the victory of human determination over systemic oppression. Comrades, remember, history is written by those who refuse to be passive. The chains you bear today are the instruments of your emancipation tomorrow. Let the world see that the oppressed, when united, are not merely a class. They are a force, unstoppable, unyielding, and destined to reshape society itself. Rise, refuse, and reclaim the future. The world as we see it today, with its seemingly unchangeable hierarchies, its distribution of wealth, its allocation of power, is not the result of natural law or divine providence. It is the product of human design, carefully constructed over centuries to benefit a small minority at the expense of the many. To perceive the present as inevitable is to accept a lie perpetuated by those who profit from maintaining it. The structures of society, The political institutions, the economic systems, the legal codes, and the cultural narratives are not neutral, impartial frameworks for organizing human life. They are instruments deliberately shaped to protect the privileges of the wealthy and powerful, to ensure their dominance, and to obscure the mechanisms of exploitation that sustain them. Every law that guarantees property, every regulation that favors capital accumulation, every ideological narrative that presents inequality as natural or deserved is part of a system designed to condition the minds of the oppressed into compliance. The present, as it stands, is a carefully maintained facade, a theatre of order that masks the underlying reality of domination and subjugation. It is structured to convince the majority that their circumstances are the result of fate, talent, or individual failure, rather than the consequence of a deliberate, exploitative social order. The wealthy few have established systems in which the labor of the many generates their wealth, yet the benefits of that labor are systematically extracted and concentrated in the hands of those who control production. Factories, farms, offices, and all sites of work become arenas where the laboring masses are compelled to convert their time, energy, and creativity into surplus value for others, while the instruments of social control, governments, militaries, courts, ensure that dissent is marginalized, that the structures of exploitation remain intact. This system does not emerge spontaneously. It is constructed with purpose, maintained through education, propaganda, and coercion, and reproduced across generations to perpetuate inequality. The economic, political, and social arrangements that appear natural are in fact the crystallized outcomes of historical struggles, in which the dominant class successfully imposed its will upon the majority. In this context, the perception of normalcy, the belief that wealth is deserved, that poverty is inevitable, that hierarchy is inevitable, is itself a tool of control. When people internalize the idea that the present is natural, they accept limitations on their ambitions, their aspirations, and their understanding of justice. They fail to recognize that the conditions of their labor, their deprivation, and their dependence are neither universal nor permanent, but contingent and manipulable. The present is structured so that power flows upward, accumulating among the owners of capital, while the majority are trained to accept the scarcity, the struggle, and the inequities that result. Education systems inculcate obedience and the illusion of meritocracy, while economic systems reward those who participate in their own subjugation. Media, culture, and ideology reinforce the narrative that inequality is inevitable, that suffering is deserved, and that the social hierarchy reflects some intrinsic natural order rather than the arbitrary design of human institutions. Even notions of freedom, democracy, and participation are tailored to maintain control, offering the illusion of choice while preserving the essential dynamics of exploitation. The construction of the present is therefore a moral and political issue. It is a conscious organization of human relations in which certain groups benefit by denying others the ability to realize their potential and claim what is rightfully theirs. Recognizing the present as constructed rather than natural is the first step toward understanding the mechanisms of oppression and imagining alternatives. It reveals that the structures we inhabit are not fixed, they are human-made and, as such, capable of transformation. The laborer who doubts the inevitability of her poverty, the thinker who questions the fairness of the system, the collective who perceives the injustice of concentrated wealth and power, they are all beginning to pierce the illusion, to see that the present is not a given but a condition imposed. Understanding that the present is constructed engages complacency. It exposes the methods by which exploitation is justified, normalized, and perpetuated, and it empowers those who labor and suffer to envision themselves as agents of change. History is a record of the ways in which dominant classes have imposed structures of control, but it is also a record of resistance, revolt, and transformation, proving that what is constructed can be deconstructed, that what is imposed can be overturned, and that the present, no matter how entrenched, is mutable under the pressure of collective consciousness and organized action. To see the present as constructed is to see the world as a battleground of interests, where human ingenuity has been harnessed not merely to produce goods or advance knowledge, but to organize and enforce hierarchies that concentrate wealth and power. This awareness does not emerge passively. It arises from critical observation, reflection, and the recognition of patterns that reveal the systemic nature of exploitation. It uncovers the web of social, economic, and political relations that render some dominant while leaving others subordinate. And it demands a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that what is widely accepted as normal, natural, or inevitable is often the deliberate outcome of historical and ongoing struggles waged by the few to control the many. Under capitalism, the labor of workers is the source of all wealth, yet paradoxically, those who create value are systematically denied the full benefits of their own production. The worker enters the factory, the workshop, the office, or the field, and invests their strength, their time, their knowledge, and their creativity into transforming raw materials into commodities, ideas into products, services into profit. Every item produced, every service rendered, is the direct result of human labor. Yet when the day ends, when the work is complete, the fruits of this labor are not returned to the worker in proportion to their contribution. Instead, they are appropriated by those who own the means of production, the factories, the tools, the machinery, and the institutions that facilitate exchange. This is the essence of exploitation under capitalism, the extraction of surplus value from the worker, the transformation of their effort into profit that enriches others, while the laborer subsists on wages that barely cover the necessities of life. The system presents work as a neutral or even virtuous activity, as though the act of labor itself is rewarded fairly. But this is an illusion. Capitalism separates the worker from the full product of their effort, ensuring that the value created is siphoned upward to those who control production and capital, while the laborer remains dependent, subordinated, and constrained by the structures that govern their activity. The worker is compelled to sell their labor as a commodity, to enter contracts that formalize this extraction, often under conditions that limit autonomy, diminish dignity, and suppress their capacity for collective negotiation. Even as their labor builds industries, infrastructure, and wealth, the worker rarely gains ownership, influence, or meaningful participation in the systems they sustain. This exploitation is not accidental or occasional. It is systemic. It arises from the fundamental logic of capitalism, which seeks to maximize profit, minimize costs, and concentrate wealth. Every law, policy, or institutional practice that appears to protect the worker, wages, labor protections, social benefits, is framed in a way that maintains the essential asymmetry of power, ensuring that while some concessions are made to prevent unrest, the extraction of surplus value continues unabated. Moreover, this exploitation extends beyond the workplace. The conditions of life under capitalism, housing, education, healthcare, and access to resources are themselves mediated by income derived from labor. A worker who produces immense value may still struggle to secure adequate living conditions because the system prioritizes capital accumulation over human well-being. Their labor is monetized and quantified, but their existence outside the workplace is subjected to the same structural inequalities that their wages cannot fully overcome. The worker is therefore trapped in a cycle, compelled to labor to survive, yet continuously deprived of the total value they create. In addition, the ideology of meritocracy and individualism under capitalism obscures the systemic nature of exploitation. Workers are encouraged to see themselves as competitors rather than collaborators, to internalize responsibility for their position within the hierarchy, and to attribute success or failure to personal ability rather than structural forces. This ideological framework not only justifies the unequal distribution of wealth, but also suppresses the recognition that exploitation is collective and systemic, not an individual misfortune. The capitalist system thrives on this separation of consciousness from material reality. Workers may be aware of their hardships, yet they are conditioned to see them as inevitable or natural, to believe that the surplus value extracted from their labor is an acceptable cost for the opportunity to work. In truth, the exploitation is totalizing. It shapes not only the economic relationship between worker and employer, but also social relations, cultural norms, and the perception of self-worth. Capitalism renders labor itself a commodity, subjected to market forces, competition, and external valuation, rather than a human activity that fulfills needs and expresses creativity. This transformation of human activity into a tool of profit ensures that even the most skilled, industrious, or innovative workers remain subordinated, bound by the logic of accumulation that governs every facet of society. Recognizing this exploitation is essential to understanding the dynamics of class struggle, for it reveals the structural dependency of the working class on the owners of capital and the inherent conflict of interest between those who produce value and those who appropriate it. The worker's labor is both necessary and devalued. It sustains the system while leaving the laborer constrained, surveilled, and economically precarious. Every commodity in the marketplace carries within it the hidden imprint of exploitation, the unacknowledged labor that has been appropriated, measured, and converted into profit for someone other than the worker. And while workers may receive wages, benefits, or recognition, these are always partial and conditional, never equivalent to the total value they create, never sufficient to grant autonomy or security, and always mediated by the structural power of capital. In essence, the exploitation of labor is the engine of capitalism, the mechanism by which wealth is concentrated, inequality is reproduced, and the system perpetuates itself, ensuring that those who produce the value remain subordinate, while those who control the means of production continue to accumulate and consolidate power. The path to liberation under a system structured by exploitation is neither individual nor accidental. It is collective, deliberate, and conscious. The working class, the oppressed, the marginalized, those who produce the wealth of society yet remain denied its full benefits, cannot rely on reform or charity, nor can they hope for emancipation from the whims of those who profit from their labor. True liberation arises only when the oppressed recognize themselves not as isolated individuals contending with circumstance, but as members of a class bound by shared material conditions, shared interests, and shared oppression. Collective consciousness is the awakening of this understanding, the recognition that personal struggles are inseparable from systemic forces, that exploitation is not an anomaly or a personal failing, and that the path to emancipation requires a united response. It is the moment when the worker sees beyond the immediate confines of their labor, beyond the narrow horizon of survival, and understands the structural mechanisms that govern life, labor, and distribution. This consciousness is both analytical and moral. It exposes the underlying structures of domination, the extraction of surplus value, the concentration of wealth, and the ideological apparatuses that normalize inequality, while simultaneously fostering a sense of justice, solidarity, and historical responsibility. Without this collective awareness, the worker is fragmented, isolated, and easily manipulated. Rivalries, competition, and divisions, whether based on occupation, skill, ethnicity, or nationality, serve to distract from the fundamental reality of shared exploitation. The capitalist system thrives on this fragmentation, ensuring that workers view one another as obstacles rather than allies, competitors rather than comrades, preventing the formation of a unified front capable of challenging systemic power. Class unity, therefore, is inseparable from collective consciousness. It is the practical manifestation of shared understanding, the organization of common interests into deliberate action, and the coordination of effort toward the dismantling of oppressive structures. A class that recognizes itself as a class does not merely act in self-interest. It strategizes, mobilizes, and exerts material force in proportion to its numbers and its labor power. Unity is the means by which dispersed and powerless individuals become a coherent force, capable of confronting the institutions, the capital, and the ideologies that sustain inequality. It transforms discontent into political and social action, complaint into revolt, and suffering into resistance. Collective consciousness and class unity also function as instruments of education and empowerment. Within the networks of solidarity, individuals learn to articulate their grievances, to understand their causes, and to communicate them in ways that expose the contradictions of the system. They acquire knowledge of economic relations, legal structures, and political mechanisms that are otherwise obscured by ideology and propaganda. Through shared experience, discussion, and organization, workers develop strategies for negotiation, for resistance, and for the creation of alternative systems of production and distribution. Consciousness without unity is impotent. Unity without consciousness is directionless. Only when these forces converge does the working class acquire the capacity to challenge the entrenched power of the ruling elite. Furthermore, the development of collective consciousness fosters resilience against the psychological and cultural tools that perpetuate subjugation. Ideologies of individualism, meritocracy, and personal failure are undermined when the oppressed recognize that their condition is the product of systemic forces rather than personal deficiency. Solidarity strengthens morale, cultivates courage, and sustains movements through periods of repression, exploitation, and demoralization. It creates a shared sense of purpose, a collective identity, and a moral imperative that cannot be easily suppressed by the threats, incentives, or propaganda of the ruling class. The history of social transformation demonstrates the centrality of these principles. The revolutions and reforms that have reshaped societies have been driven not by isolated acts of heroism, but by organized, conscious masses who understood the power of their collective labor and the necessity of unified action. Workers, peasants, and oppressed peoples, when conscious of their shared material conditions and unified in purpose, become the agents of history rather than its passive subjects. Their organization allows them to confront entrenched institutions, to challenge property relations, and to demand equitable distribution of resources and power. It enables them to resist co-optation, to assert rights, and to envision alternatives beyond the logic of profit and hierarchy. Collective consciousness and class unity are also dynamic. They grow through struggle, through confrontation, and through engagement with the material and ideological conditions of society. Every act of solidarity, every coordinated effort, every collective demand strengthens understanding, sharpens awareness, and deepens commitment. They are not static achievements, but processes of continual learning and mobilization requiring vigilance, critical reflection, and active participation. The instruments of liberation are therefore inseparable from the lived reality of the working class. They are forged in the factories, fields, streets, and assemblies where shared experience meets deliberate organization. By cultivating consciousness and unity, workers recognize that their labor is not merely a commodity to be exploited, but a source of social power capable of restructuring society. They learn that the strength of the oppressed lies not in isolated effort, but in solidarity, coordination, and the deliberate assertion of collective interests against those who seek to dominate and divide. The awareness of shared oppression combined with organized action transforms vulnerability into leverage, subordination into agency, and exploitation into the impetus for revolution. Reform under capitalism is a seductive illusion, a promise offered by those who benefit from maintaining the fundamental structures of exploitation while offering concessions that appear to address grievances. These reforms, which differ in the form of wage increases, labor protections, social welfare programs, or legislative adjustments, create the impression of progress and justice, yet they leave untouched the essential dynamics that concentrate wealth, power, and control in the hands of the ruling class. Reforms are often designed not to liberate, but to pacify, to contain discontent, and to preserve the system by offering small benefits that prevent the masses from recognizing the deeper sources of their oppression. They are palliatives, not remedies, intended to give the illusion of fairness while ensuring that the underlying mechanisms of exploitation, ownership of the means of production, appropriation of surplus value, and hierarchical control over labor remain intact. The worker may gain slightly improved conditions or a temporary increase in wages, yet the logic of capital, competition, and profit extraction continues unabated. The structural inequalities embedded in property relations and institutional power remain unchallenged and protected, while the perception of reform allows the ruling class to claim legitimacy, morality, and progressiveness. History is replete with examples of reforms that have been co-opted, diluted, or reversed when they threaten the fundamental interests of the wealthy and powerful. Minimum wage laws, labor unions, social insurance and rights protections can all be undermined through regulatory manipulation, legal reinterpretation or economic restructuring, demonstrating that incremental measures alone cannot dismantle oppression. True liberation requires more than superficial change. It requires confronting the root of power itself, challenging the foundations upon which inequality is built, and recognizing that the structures of exploitation are maintained not by accident, but by deliberate organization, ideology, and force. Reform, by design, is compatible with the continuation of hierarchy and dominance, whereas organized struggle is aimed directly at the mechanisms of oppression. Organized struggle transforms individual discontent into collective force, translating awareness of injustice into action capable of reshaping society. It mobilizes the laboring masses, unites them in a common purpose, and channels their energies toward dismantling the institutions and relations that perpetuate exploitation. Through organized struggle, the working class can leverage its collective labor power, its numerical strength, and its understanding of systemic inequities to challenge those who control the means of production and to assert demands that cannot be dismissed or absorbed by superficial concessions. The logic of struggle is fundamentally different from that of reform. It seeks not to negotiate within the confines of a system designed to protect the powerful, but to confront, disrupt, and replace the system itself. Struggle recognizes that power is not given voluntarily, that the ruling class will not relinquish control without pressure, and that incremental reforms are insufficient to achieve the radical transformation necessary for genuine emancipation. Organized struggle also cultivates consciousness, solidarity, and resilience among the oppressed. By acting collectively, workers learn to recognize the structural nature of their exploitation, to overcome divisions imposed by ideology, competition, or social conditioning, and to assert their interests as a class rather than as isolated individuals. It is through struggle that the working class acquires the experience, discipline, and coordination required to challenge entrenched power effectively. Struggle also reveals the interdependence of economic, political, and social liberation. The dismantling of oppression is not merely an economic issue, it involves confronting cultural norms, legal frameworks, political institutions, and ideological structures that reinforce hierarchy. Organized action allows the oppressed to target these interconnected mechanisms, applying pressure where isolated or passive approaches would fail. Without struggle, reforms are limited to symbolic gestures, temporary adjustments, or concessions that leave the essential structures of domination intact. Even movements that achieve partial legislative or social victories risk co-optation if they do not maintain organized pressure, collective vigilance, and the capacity to mobilize when the ruling class resists. History demonstrates that progress achieved without struggle is fragile, reversible, and often exploited to legitimize the existing order. By contrast, organized struggle builds not only immediate gains, but also the capacity for sustained action, the creation of autonomous institutions, and the development of a collective identity rooted in shared experience and class consciousness. It turns reactive grievance into proactive force, transforming oppression into the impetus for structural change. The essence of organized struggle lies in its strategic, deliberate, and collective nature. It requires planning, coordination, education, and mobilization to challenge power effectively. It is not chaotic or spontaneous rebellion, it is conscious, directed, and aimed at altering the material conditions of society. Struggle seeks to undermine the concentration of wealth and power, redistribute resources equitably, and establish social relations that prioritize human needs over profit. Only through organized struggle can the oppressed confront the ruling class on the terrain of power, assert their rights, and force structural transformation. Reform may offer temporary relief, but it leaves the machinery of exploitation intact, while organized struggle targets the mechanisms themselves, empowering the working class to reclaim control over their labor, their communities, and their destinies. Through struggle, the oppressed move from passive acceptance to active agency, from individual suffering to collective power, from reformist illusions to revolutionary possibility. It is the disciplined, unified, and conscious action of those who understand the systemic nature of oppression that has the capacity to dismantle inequality, challenge entrenched authority, and create a society in which justice, freedom, and human dignity are no longer contingent on the whims of the powerful. The future is not predetermined, it is shaped by the choices, actions, and consciousness of those who live within it. To accept injustice as inevitable is to resign oneself to the permanence of oppression, to participate unwittingly in the continuation of systems that exploit, marginalize, and subjugate. In every society structured by inequality, there exists a stark divide between those who wield power and those whose labor sustains it. Wealth, resources, and opportunity are concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority endure exploitation, deprivation, and the imposition of limitations on their freedom. To accept such a state of affairs is to consent to one's own subordination, to internalize the logic of domination as if it were natural law, and to allow the mechanisms of oppression to continue unchallenged. The refusal to accept injustice begins with consciousness. The recognition that inequality, exploitation, and marginalization are not accidents, not the result of individual failure or chance, but the products of deliberate social, economic, and political structures designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Those who awaken to this reality perceive the conditions of their own subjugation and understand that transformative change is possible only when the oppressed refuse to passively endure. Action becomes the natural extension of this awareness, for knowledge without application is impotent. The recognition of injustice alone cannot dismantle it. It must be coupled with organized, purposeful, and sustained efforts to confront and challenge the institutions, practices, and ideologies that perpetuate it. To act is to assert agency in the face of structures that seek to diminish it, to claim one's labour, one's rights, and one's humanity against the mechanisms of exploitation. The refusal to accept injustice manifests in countless forms, in collective mobilization, in protest, in advocacy, in the creation of alternative social, economic, and political arrangements that prioritize the well-being of the many over the enrichment of the few. It is a refusal that is both moral and strategic, grounded in the understanding that systems of power are maintained not only through violence and coercion, but also through consent, passivity, and the acquiescence of the majority. Every act of defiance, every instance of organized resistance, chips away at the legitimacy of unjust authority and creates openings for transformation. Those who act to change injustice do not merely challenge individual wrongs, they confront the structural conditions that generate oppression, identifying the economic, political, and social relations that must be altered to achieve genuine equity. They understand that injustice is systemic, and therefore the strategies of resistance must also be systemic, coordinated, and collective. This refusal to accept injustice is inherently revolutionary, for it disrupts the assumed permanence of inequality and asserts the possibility of a different social order. The future belongs to those who cultivate such courage, who refuse to be paralyzed by fear, disillusionment, or the seeming inevitability of oppression. They recognize that the labor of organizing, educating, and mobilizing is itself a form of power, that solidarity multiplies individual capacity, and that collective action can confront and overturn entrenched hierarchies. By acting, they convert consciousness into force, transforming awareness into tangible change and turning resistance into the engine of social transformation. Moreover, the refusal to accept injustice cultivates resilience, perseverance, and innovation among those who seek change. It demands critical engagement with the structures of power, the capacity to anticipate countermeasures by those invested in maintaining dominance, and the ability to adapt strategies to shifting circumstances. This active engagement fosters a sense of agency and responsibility, demonstrating that the trajectory of history is not solely dictated by those who hold wealth and authority, but by those who refuse to accept the conditions imposed upon them. The future, in this sense, is a product of intentional struggle. It is shaped not by passivity, compliance, or resignation, but by the determined actions of those who recognize injustice and commit themselves to its eradication. Those who act to change injustice must also recognize the interconnection of struggles across time and space, understanding that their actions contribute to broader movements, historical processes, and collective aspirations for liberation. Every protest, every strike, every act of defiance, and every campaign for justice contributes to a continuum of resistance that accumulates power and knowledge, strengthens solidarity, and expands the possibilities for a more equitable society. Refusing to accept injustice is not a passive moral stance, it is an active engagement with the forces that shape society, a deliberate intervention to realign structures of power with principles of fairness, equality, and human dignity. It is through this combination of awareness, courage, and coordinated action that the oppressed can assert their interests, challenge entrenched authority, and reshape the conditions of their own lives. The future, therefore, is inseparable from the choices of those who refuse to acquiesce, who recognize that injustice is neither natural nor immutable, and who act decisively to create a world in which oppression is confronted, equality is pursued, and the humanity of all is affirmed. The struggle we face is not abstract, nor is it optional. It is the material reality of our lives under a system designed to extract, exploit, and divide. The present is neither natural nor inevitable. It is a construct, carefully maintained to serve the wealthy and powerful. Workers, though they produce the wealth of society, remain exploited, their labor converted into profit for others, while their needs and potential are systematically constrained. Yet this oppression is not absolute. Collective consciousness awakens the understanding that personal struggles are shared struggles, and class unity transforms fragmented discontent into organized power capable of confronting entrenched hierarchies. Reform alone is insufficient. Concessions within a system of exploitation can never dismantle the structures of domination. Only through deliberate, sustained, and collective struggle can the mechanisms of oppression be challenged and ultimately overthrown. The future belongs to those who refuse to accept injustice, who recognize the systemic roots of inequality, and who act with courage, solidarity, and strategic purpose to transform society. Liberation is not granted, it is claimed by those who awaken to their collective strength, who refuse to accept the present, and who organize to create a world where labor serves humanity rather than capital, where freedom, dignity, and justice are not privileges of a few, but the rights of all.